I remember the exact second her voice went flat. Not angry, just finished. We were standing near the school gate, that place where everyone pretended not to listen. She didn't look at me when she said it. She said we were too young, that it was nobody's fault, that life was starting, and this had to end before it got complicated. I nodded like I understood. My mouth even smiled a little. Then I heard myself say it, quiet, automatic, almost polite. So why am I the only one who can't breathe right now? The words hung there, useless. She finally looked at me then, and I knew something had already closed. Not later, not someday. Right there. Before that day, my life was small in a way that felt permanent. School in the morning, work a few afternoons a week, the same streets, the same faces. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, just repetition. And her. She fit into it so easily that I never thought of her as something that could be removed. She was part of the schedule, like the bell between classes or the bus that always came 5 minutes late. We met the way people did back then, by sitting close enough for long enough that silence stopped being awkward. Same class, same jokes passed on folded paper, same boredom during lectures. It grew slowly, without a moment you could point to and say, that's when it started. One day she was just there, and then she mattered. That was it. We were young, yes, but not careless. We didn't talk about forever, but we acted like time was on our side. We planned weeks ahead, which felt like a commitment. We learned each other's moods. I knew when she needed space and when she wanted me to insist. She knew when I was pretending not to be hurt. We were careful with each other in ways adults later failed to be. After school, we'd walk without a destination. Sometimes we'd sit on the steps behind the gym, our shoulders touching, not speaking. Physical closeness felt serious then. A hand held too long meant something. A kiss wasn't casual. It stayed with you the rest of the day, like proof. At home, no one asked many questions. Our parents were busy surviving their own lives. As long as grades didn't fall and doors closed at reasonable hours, we were invisible. That invisibility felt like freedom. We filled it with promises we never spoke out loud. I remember thinking that whatever came next, college, work, distance, we'd adjust. Not because we had a plan, but because we always had. Every small problem before that had solved itself just by us staying. I mistook continuity for strength. I thought time rewarded patience automatically. Looking back, I see how narrow our world was, how loud school felt, how permanent emotions seemed when your life hadn't really begun. But at the time, it was everything I had. My sense of who I was included her without question. I didn't imagine myself without her voice next to mine, correcting my memories, reminding me of things I'd forgotten. There were signs, maybe. Days when she was quieter, moments when she pulled away just enough for me to notice. I noticed, but I didn't interpret. I assumed closeness was something you could pause and resume. I didn't know people sometimes step back to practice leaving. So when we walked toward the gate that afternoon, I thought it was just another ending to a school day. The sun was too bright. Someone laughed behind us. Everything looked normal enough to be permanent. The moment itself was smaller than I expected. No shouting, no scene, just a shift. We were walking slower than usual, like neither of us wanted to arrive anywhere. She stopped first. I took one more step before realizing she wasn't beside me anymore. That half step still feels important. She said my name the way people do when they're about to be careful. She didn't touch me. That was new. Her hands stayed wrapped around her backpack straps, knuckles pale, like she was holding herself in place. She talked about timing, about how everything was changing. about choices that were coming faster than we could keep up with. She said we were too young to make something this heavy follow us into whatever came next. I listened. I really did. I told myself this was what understanding looked like. I nodded at the right moments. I didn't interrupt. When she paused, I waited, thinking there would be more. There wasn't. The silence stretched, thin and final. I asked if I had done something wrong. She shook her head immediately. Too quickly. She said it wasn't about that it was about her needing space, about wanting to know who she was without having to explain herself to someone else all the time. I wanted to say that I never asked her to explain, that I liked her exactly as she was, but I could hear how small that sounded, even before I said it. Then she said the thing that stayed. She said she didn't want to hurt me later, as if this moment was the gentle version, as if pain could be scheduled and minimized like that. I felt something in me panic, quiet and fast. The realization that this wasn't a discussion. It was a delivery. I remember the sound of the gate behind us. Metal. Someone pushing through, impatient. Life continuing without hesitation. She said she hoped we could still be friends. She said she'd always care about me. Those sentences landed like objects I didn't know where to put. I couldn't imagine a version of us that didn't involve choosing each other first. Friendship felt like a word adults used when they were trying to be kind. That's when I said it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just honest enough to surprise both of us. I asked why, if we were too young. It felt like I was the only one losing something real. The question wasn't an accusation. It was confusion. My body asking before my pride could stop it. She looked at me then, really looked. And for a second, I thought she might take it back. Not everything, just enough. But instead, her face softened in a way that meant goodbye. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know how to explain it better. She said this was still the right decision. Right decision. The words echoed. Decisions were supposed to come with reasons you could hold on to. This one didn't. It just existed. Solid. Unmovable. We stood there a few seconds longer, like neither of us knew the choreography for ending something that had grown without rules. Then she stepped back. One step. Enough to change the air. She turned toward the street, not running, not hesitating, just leaving. I stayed where I was until I couldn't hear her footsteps anymore. Only then did I understand that the moment hadn't been small at all. It had just been quiet. And that quiet had already started rearranging everything. After that, time didn't move the way it used to. Days still passed, but they didn't stack properly. Everything felt loose, unfinished. I kept expecting something to correct itself. A message. A pause. A moment where she'd realize she'd gone too far and come back with a different sentence. None of that happened. At school, we learned how to orbit each other without colliding. Same hallways, same friends, different gravity. I became aware of how often I looked for her without meaning to. In crowds, in reflections, in the empty chair beside me. Every time I didn't see her, there was a small adjustment I had to make, like my body was relearning balance. People noticed, but no one asked the right questions. They said things like, "You'll be fine," or "It's just young love," as if the word just could shrink what I felt, as if age determined depth. I didn't argue. I didn't defend it. I let them minimize it because I didn't have the language to explain how real it had been, how complete. She was polite when we spoke, careful. That hurt more than distance would have. She smiled at the right moments. She asked how I was doing, the way someone asks when they already know the answer but need confirmation. I lied without effort. I said I was okay. I said I understood. Understanding became my new reflex. It cost me more each time. At home, nothing changed, which made everything worse. Dinner at the same time. The same sounds through the walls. My room still held traces of her. Notes folded too many times. A sweater she'd left behind. I didn't move them. I told myself it was temporary. That this phase would end the way others had. Quietly. Naturally. Like it always did. But I started noticing things about myself that scared me. How silence followed me. How I replayed conversations not to learn, but to punish myself. I searched for mistakes, believing that if I could find the exact moment I failed, I could undo it. I convinced myself that growth meant endurance, that if I stayed calm enough, mature enough, she'd see it. I made small choices that felt reasonable at the time. I gave her space. I didn't text first. I avoided places where I knew she'd be, then resented her for not noticing my absence. Each decision felt like proof of respect. Together, they became a disappearance. Weeks passed. Then more. I watched her laugh with other people. Not romantically, just freely. I realized she was already practicing the life she'd mentioned. The one that didn't include explaining herself. I was still stuck at the gate, emotionally, repeating a conversation that was already done. The pressure wasn't dramatic. It was constant. A low, persistent weight. The kind that doesn't knock you down, just slowly bends you out of shape. I kept waiting for the pain to peak and release. Instead, it settled in, became familiar, almost functional. I told myself this was part of growing up, that this was what people meant when they talked about learning lessons. But nothing felt learned, only endured. And somewhere in that endurance, I started to understand that nothing was going to return to what it had been. Not because we were too young, but because one of us had already stepped forward, and the other was still standing still. The moment it finally broke wasn't dramatic. That's what surprised me. I always thought endings announced themselves, that they arrived loud, undeniable. This one came disguised as restraint. It was after school again. Different day. Same light. I saw her across the courtyard, sitting on the low wall near the trees. She was laughing, not loudly, easily. Someone else was standing there talking, hands moving the way people do when they're comfortable. There was nothing inappropriate about it. Nothing I could reasonably object to. That made it worse. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough to realize I was waiting for permission I was never going to get. Permission to feel replaced. Permission to matter again. When she noticed me, her smile adjusted. Just a fraction. She excused herself and walked over. Alone. That walk told me everything I'd been avoiding. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't conflicted. She was prepared. She asked if I was okay. The same question. Same tone. This time, something in me refused to cooperate. I didn't want to be okay anymore. I didn't want to be mature or understanding or patient. I wanted the truth to exist between us without being softened. I told her I couldn't keep pretending this was temporary. I told her the space she asked for had turned into a wall, and I was still standing on my side, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was steady in a way that surprised me. She listened. I'll give her that. She didn't interrupt, but I could see it in her face. The same softness as before, the same finality. When I finished, she took a breath, slow and practiced, like someone who'd rehearsed disappointment. She said she didn't want to hurt me. Again. She said I deserved someone who could meet me where I was. She said this wasn't fair to either of us. Fair. Another word that sounded clean and reasonable, and meant nothing to me in that moment. I realized then that I was asking her to carry something she'd already put down, and I was carrying it harder, heavier, because of that. So I did the one thing I hadn't allowed myself to do yet. I stopped negotiating. I told her I couldn't stay friends. Not like this. Not while pretending I was fine watching her move forward while I stood still. I said it calmly. No accusation. No threat. Just a boundary I was late to discover. Her eyes filled, but she didn't argue. That hurt more than if she had. She nodded, like I'd finally said something she recognized as real. She said she understood. I believed her. For the first time since the gate, I believed her. We stood there, the distance between us measured and deliberate. Then she did something small that ended everything. She reached out, touched my arm, briefly, and said goodbye. Not see you, not later. Goodbye. I didn't stop her. I didn't follow. I watched her walk away and felt something close inside me, slow and irreversible. Not relief, not peace, just an ending that finally matched the loss. That was the decision. Not hers, mine. And the sound it made wasn't loud. It was the quiet click of a door locking from the inside. What stayed wasn't the pain itself. That faded unevenly, the way things do when you don't rush them. What stayed was the shape it left behind. A kind of outline in my memory that other moments never quite filled. We didn't speak after that. Not out of anger, just accuracy. Our lives continued on separate tracks, close enough to notice, far enough to stay intact. I heard about her in fragments, someone mentioning a new school, a different routine, the way her name surfaced and then disappeared again. Each time it felt smaller, manageable, like a bruise you stop pressing. I carried the experience quietly. I didn't turn it into a story right away. For a long time, it was just something I knew about myself, that I could care deeply without being loud about it, that I could lose something real without anyone around me recognizing it as a loss worth naming. Years later, I understand why she said what she said. Not because I agree, but because I've lived enough life to see how fear can dress itself up as clarity. How leaving can feel like strength when staying would require more honesty than you have. I don't blame her. Blame would mean I was still waiting for something. What surprised me was how often that memory returned when decisions mattered. When I hesitated. When I chose silence over insistence. That early ending taught me something I didn't ask to learn. That timing can outweigh intention. And that wanting something isn't the same as being able to carry it. I've loved since then. Fully. Differently. With more awareness of what it costs to stay. But that first loss set a baseline. It showed me that some endings don't come from betrayal or cruelty, but from someone stepping forward before you're ready to follow. Sometimes I still think of that afternoon by the gate. Not with longing, with recognition. It was the first time I understood that responsibility doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it means letting go cleanly, even when it hurts unevenly. She said we were too young. Maybe we were. But what I learned then stayed with me into adulthood, shaping how I measure closeness, how I respect distance, how I listen when someone tells me they're leaving. I don't replay it anymore to find a different outcome. I replay it to remember who I was before I learned how choices echo. Before I knew that some truths arrive early and stay.